I'm going to sit here. Good afternoon, and on behalf of the New York Encounter, I welcome all of you, both here at the Metropolitan Pavilion as well as joining us online, to this panel on Why Have Children? My name is Margarita Mooney Clayton. I teach in the Department of Practical Theology at the Princeton Theological Seminary, and I will be your moderator today. I have had the pleasure of knowing Brad Wilcox from the University of Virginia since we were both graduate students in sociology at Princeton just a few years ago. He is the Jefferson Scholars Foundation University Professor of Sociology and the Director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Professor Wilcox's research focuses on the quality and stability of marriage and family life in the United States and around the globe. Professor Wilcox is the author or co-editor of at least 5 books, the most recent of which is Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites. And his research is featured regularly in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Atlantic Magazine, the New York Times, and National Public Radio. Nicholas Eberstadt will be joining us online. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development, and specifically on international security in Korea and Asia. He is the author of several books and regularly appears on major TV networks. Mr. Eberstadt has a PhD in political economy and government, as well as an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a bachelor's from Harvard University. And he has a master's from the London School of Economics. So to get us going on this wonderful question of why have children, I'm going to turn first to Mr. Eberstadt, who will be joining us online, and he will get us going with this kind of general question. What is this demographic drop-off when for so long the discourse around population was that the world was overpopulated and that was the greatest threat to our future? So thank you for joining us, Nicholas, and please get us going on this question of the global depopulation problem.
Margarita, Brad, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to this important gathering. I'm delighted to be with you remotely. We're not used to thinking about the low-income world as being a drug replacement fertility zone. But the world as a whole now is a place where maybe 3/4 of humanity living in countries where childbearing levels are not adequate to maintain population stability. And since we know that the rich countries are only a small fraction of the world's population, this means that the overwhelming majority of low-income venues in the world are now sub-replacement venues. And I think this will come as a big surprise to many people, but we've been overtaken by the facts in this area. All of East Asia now is in the midst of a depopulation. For East Asia as a whole, fertility levels are only half of what would be needed for long-term population stability. If you go down to Southeast Asia, almost every country there is now below replacement. Even least developed countries like Myanmar, India is a below replacement society. If you go to the city of Calcutta, which I first visited half a century ago, you'll find that birth levels are about 1 child per woman per lifetime. Astonishing what's happening. And we could keep on spinning the globe. We could go over to the New World. In Mexico City, birth levels are below one baby per woman per lifetime. For the first time, as we start collecting figures, birth levels are lower in Mexico than in the USA. Same thing with Colombia, same thing with Chile, same thing with Brazil. One of the numbers that astonishes me is in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, the birth numbers are down to below one baby per lifetime per woman if current trends continue. So we are aware of both fertility, of the childbearing revolution that's happened in Europe, in the United States, Canada, and other countries, but it's not just affluent developed areas anymore. I know Brad tells much more about what's going on in the USA.
Well, thank you, Nick. I will say it is quite shocking or surprising to think that in some of the examples you gave, like Calcutta, for example, that there's basically below replacement fertility, which means that the population will decline. And we're used to thinking about that maybe when it comes to Europe or perhaps the United States. But if I heard you correctly, you said 3/4 of the world are now countries where there are less people, where the population will effectively be declining. So now let's hear, sorry, Nick, yes, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yes. We don't have complete information right now because the returns are not in for sub-Saharan Africa because their statistical systems aren't as solid as in much of the rest of the world. It's not impossible when the returns come in for 2024 that the entire planet, on average, will be below replacement fertility. It's not impossible that we've already entered sub-replacement for our species as a whole.
Wow, okay. Well, thank you. Let's continue with some more information that Brad will share with us, and then we will go into a little bit of why behind these trends and what does this mean for us?
Thanks. Thank you, Nick, and thanks, Margarita. I want to kind of turn our attention kind of away from the globe for a second here and focus more on kind of the story that's unfolding in the United States. And certainly I think one of the most proximate dimensions of this dramatic transformation that we're seeing in fertility is the fact that kind of love and marriage have fallen on kind of harder fortunes of late. And here we go. What I kind of describe this as in my book, Get Married, is kind of the American heart is closing. We're seeing obviously less dating, less mating, and less marrying here. So we've seen the marriage rate come down by more than 60%, for instance, in the US since 1970. And that might kind of seem a relatively abstract number. What does that kind of mean in practice for the young adults who are here today, of whom there are many, as I've seen? Well, what it means, as we see here in I think the next slide, is that about 1 in 3 young adults in this country, folks who are in their early 20s basically, are projected now to never marry, kind of be permanent bachelors, permanent bachelorettes. We've kind of never been in a moment, culturally and demographically, where so many people are going to go through the life course without the benefit of having a spouse, of being married. So that's sort of one manifestation, again, of this kind of closing of the American heart. And then it has obvious implications kind of for the subject of today's conversation, and that is that the fertility rate in the US, partly as a consequence of this decline in marriage, has fallen dramatically in recent years. And we're now seeing a fertility rate in the US of 1.6, so well below the replacement rate of 2.1 babies on average. But again, what does that kind of mean for the young adult population more generally today? And what it means, as this slide here indicates, is we're projecting now that 1 in 4, again, 1 in 4 young men and young women today will never have kids. So a lot of folks never having kind of the burden, but also the blessing of being a mother, or the burden or blessing of being a father. Again, these are kind of what I would say are manifestations of this closing of the American heart. Now, it's important to understand and appreciate that there are figures out there, scholars out there, like Eric Klinenberg behind me, who actually teaches pretty close by at NYU, would kind of minimize these trends, would kind of say that this is a manifestation of the ways in which we as a country are kind of giving people more freedom to live their best lives, often as single people. And his book, Going Solo, kind of does, I think, a pretty good job of articulating that distinct perspective. But as you might guess, I think he's off the mark. Because, in a nation that's marked by rising economic inequality, in a society that's, I think, increasingly addicted to what I call electronic opiates, and we kind of all, I think, know what I'm talking about here. At a time when a lot of folks, particularly younger adults, are kind of beset by loneliness, I think it's kind of in this context that marriage and family actually matter more than ever for the welfare not just of kids, but also for adults. There's a way in which, again, particularly in a context marked by greater economic inequality, by more technological distractions, and also by growing atomization, that having the benefit of a spouse and of children, I think, is even more beneficial for Americans and adults in particular than it was in earlier decades. And so what I'm talking about is, people like Scott, who I profile in my book. Scott has, a lot of things going for him by kind of contemporary standards. He's got a graduate degree, he's got a good job, he's got a six-figure salary. But as I speak to Scott, who kind of lives in the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C., he talks about the way in which he kind of feels like there's no one there for him. He's not married, he doesn't have kids, he's in his mid-30s. He kind of comes home, every evening, kind of does the same thing with his dog, and he kind of worries about what might happen to him, what might kind of befall him if he should ever get sick later in life. And there's kind of nothing really to anchor his weekends as well. Like there's no spouse to hang out with, there are no kids to kind of bring to soccer or football. All these kinds of things are kind of absent from his life, and he kind of betrays a certain kind of sadness as I speak to him. And Scott's experience is by no means a kind of outlier, because what we're seeing in the social science about kind of sort of the character of contemporary life is that reports of happiness in America, that kind of classic declaration idea about the kind of pursuit of happiness, fewer and fewer Americans are reporting that they're happy with their lives. And one recent study from Chicago finds that the most powerful predictor of this decline in happiness is the fact that fewer Americans are kind of finding their way into marriage and family life. And then we turn to this issue of deaths of despair. We know that more and more Americans are dying for reasons related to drug overdoses, to suicides, to alcohol poisonings. What we see in the data is that, again, kind of the biggest predictor of this trend in American life is the fact that fewer Americans are kind of embedded in a marriage and family context. And then finally, when it comes to just kind of the health of the American dream, what we know is that communities where marriage and family life are weaker, based upon Raj Chetty's work here, mentioned up on the screen, are communities too where kids' odds of realizing the American dream as measured by kind of like the classic rags to riches phenomenon from poverty to relative affluence, they're much less likely to realize that American dream in communities where marriage and family are weak. So again, I would suggest to you this afternoon, as we're kind of talking about the subject, that the fact that marriage and family life have become much more difficult for adults is having a lot of profoundly concerning consequences that we kind of see unfolding around us in this contemporary moment.
Thank you, Brad. I wanted to follow up with what you and Nick opened us up with and think a little bit about what are some of the causes of the lower fertility and global population decline. You've just mentioned marriage rates. But Nick, I wanted to turn back to you for a moment because your work really was more on economic development and international security, but you've also written about labor and work and responsibility. And I wondered, what was it that led you to even begin to see that in places such as Korea or India, that the population is not replacing itself? And when you present this research in one of those contexts, is this phenomenon a concern to policymakers? Because one could say that a decreasing population has happened historically, but it's happened unfortunately, through war or plagues. But it seems that this decline in population is happening by choice. So I wonder if, Nick, could you just tell us a little bit more about how in your work at the American Enterprise Institute you even turned your attention to this question of population, and what is the policy level response that you get when discussing this in places that are newly perhaps facing a population decline?
Well, Margarita, I started working on global population back when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, and the intellectual flavor of the decade was sort of a terror about what was called the population explosion, because world numbers were increasing at a very rapid tempo at that point. There was a consensus, a sort of an anti-natal consensus in much of the academy and much of the policy world at that time that it was essential to bring down birth rates, encourage smaller families in poor countries, else we have a Malthusian catastrophe. It was based upon a really shoddy and fundamentally flawed analysis of what was going on in the world at the time. It wasn't that we had suddenly started breeding like rabbits, that we had actually finally stopped dying like flies. The increase in world population was being driven by a health explosion. And if you have to have a population problem, the health explosion is a pretty good one to have. So in this sort of continuing misassessment of the human population condition, the paradox is that we've had greater growth in human numbers over the past half century than ever before. We're healthier, richer, better educated, better fed than humanity's ever been. People in the academy and I think in policy circles weren't ready to confront the possibility that by voluntary choice, people actually would arrive at a situation where sub-replacement fertility became the norm, and where global population peaking and decline looked like it would be a possibility much sooner than anybody would have imagined. I mean, that looks like that's what's going to be in the cards for this century. Only question is when. If I go to a place like South Korea, where birth levels are 2/3 below the threshold of population stability, people talk about this phenomenon, but it's a little bit of a sort of a deer in the headlight phenomenon. People talk about it, but they don't really seem to understand yet what this is going to mean for their society. And they certainly haven't thought about either adapting to this or changing.
Thank you. So, Brad, you've mentioned this phenomenon of, well, obviously, there's going to be a decline, or it seems obvious there would be a decline in fertility if there is a decline in marriage, and the large numbers of people in this country who will never marry and never have children. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on that, on the changing outlook on marriage, because it struck me listening this morning to one of the panels where Carter Snead mentioned that, one of the things about birth or children or why have children, you can't plan things. Children remind you that life isn't just a drop-down menu, that you need to be welcoming of surprises. And I remembered when I lost my grandfather, and I was after the funeral chatting with my grandmother, and they had raised 14 children in Cuba. And I said to my grandmother, "Abuelita, did you always want 14 children?" And she said, "Oh no, 12. And I was just, what? And she said, "Well, that was the biggest number I could think of, and look how God has provided." And so back then, in an agricultural society, there was just a sense that marriage and childbirth is part of nature and God will provide and there will be a way and we don't need to she didn't have a plan. And my question came from this mentality of, I'm your granddaughter and I need to plan this. Well, it wasn't in my plan to be one of the statistics that you presented, which is a childless woman. I married in my late 40s to a man in his 50s, but I don't have biological children. So I was growing up in this sort of, well, everyone in my family seems to have children, and I'm the one who doesn't. And so thanks to you, when you adopted your first son, I just hung out at your house all the time and had a wonderful time. But why this sense that, on the one hand, people desire marriage and children so much that they have a great plan for it, and yet it doesn't happen?
So I think in terms of understanding kind of why both marriage and then fertility have come down in recent decades, I think part of the story here is that people actually are less sort of planful when it comes to sort of like dating, love, and marriage today than they are with respect oftentimes towards their education and work. So there's a kind of what I call a kind of a Midas mindset that tends to preoccupy, particularly younger adults, more on the upper end of the SES ladder, rather than a mindset that's sort of geared towards getting more serious about dating and marrying. So one example of this, for instance, is I was talking to my RA 2 years ago at UVA, who was a young Catholic guy, and I asked him about his plans for the future in terms of his career, and he had a very kind of detailed plan about he's going to go get his MBA in 2 years, and he was going to go work for this consulting company before then he was going to do this with his career after that. Very clearly kind of had planned out that part of his life. But then I asked him, well, would you like to get married? And he said, yes. I said, well, kind of, are you dating anyone? No. Is there any plan there to kind of like get things going? And it was complete silence. So he hadn't really kind of devoted the same level of kind of intentionality to dating and marriage that he had towards work and career. So I think part of our challenge today is that we're kind of focusing often more on education and work, but there's some other larger currents, obviously, that explain why I think both fertility has come down and marriage has come down in the broader culture. And those currents are things like you and I would call expressive individualism in our sociological training at Princeton, greater secularization, but then also some huge technological shifts that have affected, obviously, things like birth control, but also more recently, kind of the impact of smartphones. So I think part of the story kind of lurking behind Nick's comments this afternoon about kind of this pattern of dramatic declines in fertility across the globe is that we're also seeing coupling come way down in places as varied as Turkey and as Tunisia and Vietnam. And it does seem like the proliferation of smartphones, both in terms of kind of being sort of vehicles of making us more distant from it, but also in terms of conveying certain ideas, maybe unrealistic expectations about life and love, that have also kind of had a hand. So I think, again, these broader shifts in technology, in individualism and secularization. And the final thing that I would mention is just the character of the relationships between the sexes today. And there's a lot one could say about that, but I do see over and over again, as I speak to younger women in both the left and the right, in both religious and more secular circles, is a kind of frustration on their part. They often kind of say it's hard for them to find a guy who is kind of marriageable, who's kind of got his act together, who's got a full-time job, who's got a kind of clear sense of his future. And so I think part of the challenge facing many countries too is that there are ways in which younger men are having greater difficulty in maturing and launching, and then that kind of has implications for people's capacity to date successfully and to get married. So these are some of the things that I see kind of playing out that would help us to understand why both in the US and other places, both kind of dating and marriage and then childbearing and family formation have become more vexing, more challenging.
So part of what I hear you saying is that the sort of markers of being a responsible adult have shifted into career and work goals, which people are very able to articulate and pursue. But I wonder if we could, for a moment, I might turn to Nick here on this, because you also mentioned it, this phenomenon, beyond that, the phenomenon of social media, because I've been hearing lately, for example, from Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, looking internationally at the smartphone and the coincidence between the emergence of smartphone technology and the drop in fertility. And the picture that I've come away with is that there are people, for example, in countries in Asia, maybe Japan or China, where the fertility decline was already happening, that are from one-child families, perhaps, that spend a lot of time on their smartphones and actually are not spending much time around people at all, which doesn't seem like the kind of social context that would lead to marriage. So again, Nick, what have you observed with the connection between technology, smartphones, and the drop in fertility?
Well, I think Brad put his finger on it. Our little friend here is just a huge technological disruptor. It may turn out to be almost as consequential as the pill. Um, in my anecdotal travels in places like Turkey or places like India or East Asia, um, this little this little thing, which I guess sometimes I am tempted to refer to as a Narcissus mirror, people jumping through this Narcissus mirror and living a sort of an alternative life on the other side of the screen. I'm not convinced it's a better life than the flesh and blood life that we all have the option for. I think this is going to turn out to be something very consequential. I don't have statistics and hard data to prove this yet. This is more of an intuition. But it is striking that this acceleration in birth drops, in fertility drops, tracks so closely with the proliferation all over the world of smartphones. And smartphones are everywhere, if you don't know it, is all through the less developed countries as well. When I think about what you and Brad were saying, one of the things that comes to mind, since I had the disability of being trained in economics, there's a lot of wonderful work in economics from Nobel laureates like Ted Schultz and Gary Becker and the Chicago School, which I think is absolutely terrific. But what it can't get you to, I don't think, is the big change in exogenous tastes, as an economist would say it, that we've seen over the last generation and certainly over the last decade, because those are taken as given in economic training. But we've had a huge change in tastes all around the world. And if I were to describe it, I would suggest that we've had this rise and maybe triumph of the quest for autonomy in all sorts of different societies. And autonomy, convenience, they seem to still be the sort of trump card in what's going on in family development and of course, in family formation as well. So what you're really seeing is something like a flight from the family in search of autonomy and convenience. And children are quite wonderful. I mean, I can tell you that as a parent, but one thing that they are not is convenient. So we've got this flight from the weak by the strong that's going on in our society and in so many other countries. The only little kick to this, of course, is that everybody begins their life as a dependent, and they very often conclude their life as dependents. So this is a pretty tough sword to live by.
So one kind of additional point to build on what Nick was just saying is that we've been getting kind of like exogenous shifts in kind of a culture, and we've been getting more and more messaging from our culture that basically, being a parent, especially being a mother, is a route towards misery and not towards flourishing. There was a piece in the New York Times by a Brooklyn writer, and the only seen Brooklyn writer is kind of mining this vein, and she said that heterosexual married motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. And she kind of went on to chronicle her travails as both a wife and as a mother again, over there in Brooklyn. And there's been a lot of pieces, again, published kind of from Brooklyn in this spirit. But it's emblematic of certain, I think, suspicion that we've seen emerge, particularly in elite culture, but also now in social media, towards marriage, especially towards parenthood, even more so towards motherhood. And we're now at a point in the U.S. where younger single women think that the path to happiness runs away from family life and towards the single and free life. Some work done by my colleague and Nick's colleague, Dan Cox, again, is finding that for younger single women, they think they're happier staying single rather than getting married and having kids. And yet what they don't appreciate, what they don't know, is that the data point in just the opposite direction. So we see in America today, based upon my work with Dr. Wendy Wang, is that for women, there's no group of women who are happier than married mothers. And the same thing is true for men, married fathers. So married moms are almost twice as likely to be very happy with their lives compared to single and childless women aged 18 to 55. And for men, they're more than twice as likely to be very happy with their lives if they're married fathers compared to being single, childless men. So the kind of more feminist, some thinking that I mentioned in the New York Times, the new right thinking of Andrew Tate, who says there's kind of zero statistical advantage when it comes to marriage and then family life more generally. This kind of talk, this kind of thinking, this kind of anti-natalist, kind of anti-nuptial thinking is really off the mark because, again, for ordinary women and men across the U.S., per the kind of title for today, being a mother and a father is associated with more happiness than being childless. And what's striking, too, about the data is we're seeing actually evidence that the gap between parents and childless adults in terms of happiness is growing now in favor of parents being more happy than their childless peers. And I think this might tie back, too, to the points that I made before about the way in which there are fewer alternative sources of meaning and social solidarity, I think, in our broader society besides, marriage and family. So again, in terms of why have kids, one, I think, way to think about this just sociologically is that it's one of the few places where you kind of have this intense experience of meaning, direction, solidarity, and so many opportunities both to receive care but also to give care. And this is what really makes us fully human.
Wow. Well, the question we're talking about, right? Why have children? I mean, thinking about what are some of the deep cultural and psychological implications of this situation of declining fertility. And, in addition to my mom being one of 14, my dad was the oldest of 7 from Floral Park, New York. And I remember I asked that grandmother one time, is it hard to raise 7 children? And she goes, nah, kids come with instructions. But one day, a friend of mine, a colleague who is from China, gave birth, and she was overjoyed. And so I go to her house to meet the baby, and she's holding the baby like it's a plate, and the baby's head's kind of whacking around. And she's like, what do I do with the bottle? And I'm like, well, you just take the baby, and you go like this, and you hold his head, and you stick the bottle. And she's like, how did you learn to do that? And I thought, and then she told me she had never in her life touched a baby until the day she gave birth. And I was kind of speechless. But if this reality that we're hearing today is true, right, that in a society where there's one child, there's 30 or 40 years between the age of the mother and the age of the child, you don't have the grandmothers showing you what to do as I did. You don't have aunts and uncles and cousins galore like I did. And you don't know anything about a baby until you have one. But what struck me was that when this friend of mine became a mother, there was nothing more important to her than to be a good mother. So the desire was there, but she actually needed an instruction manual. So I wonder if this is the reality that we're in and people aren't having children, but they desire it. Is that human desire to have children still something we can activate? And if so, for those who have that desire but haven't had the blessing of a big family like I have, what's the instruction? Do we need to publish an instruction manual on how to do this?
Margarita, I think you've put the finger on something that's terribly important here. Because back in the 70s and 80s, E.O. Wilson and sociobiology, kind of ruled intellectually as a fashion. And this was the idea that we're all kind of like hardwired to perform like human beings. One of the ways that this would have worked out if sociobiology had actually been all that is we probably would have been hardwired to reproduce our numbers over time. We're seeing a kind of a pretty heavy existence proof that we need a rethink on that sociobiology stuff. And so if E.O. Wilson is out, René Girard is in. And the whole idea of mimetics and social imitation and social learning and social knowledge is crucial. My boss and much better half, Mary Eberstadt, wrote a book in which she makes an analogy to the cat stuck in the tree, which we've heard about, seen when the fire department comes to get the kitty off of the branch. It always turns out that that's a cat that was a pet that was raised apart from its family, that didn't have the social learning to know how to get down from a tree. And we've got the analogy now with the kind of decline of social learning about large families. This is all going to have to be redone. It's a lot easier to burn your social capital with social learning than it is to augment it. But it most certainly is possible to do that, especially if you describe the problem, see it as something that's a social need, and find it open to discussion.
Question, do we need an instruction manual about how to hold a baby and burp a baby? The deeper question is, what is this process as you described it, Nick? If this process that I lived organically of being around children and learning the beauty, every child was every birth of a cousin of mine was a cause of celebration and joy, and most of the holidays in the year were marked by birthdays or baptism or communion. There were all of these events around the raising of a children in which everybody participated, so that when I was childless, and I still am, though I have stepchildren now, I was a part of the raising of children, even though they weren't my children. And I saw Brad's family go from the first son that he adopted to the fifth child he adopted, to his wife giving birth to twins, and then having his eighth child, and it was very natural for me. So what is this sort of natural, organic process of mimesis and social learning around the joy of children? Yes, the responsibility for sure, but that, as I've seen in so many people who maybe don't come from the kind of background I do, that desire for connection, that desire to give of oneself to the raising of the next generation, that even if for many of the people, Brad, in your stats, who will be childless and will be marriageless, what does it mean for really to recover this sense of great joy and wonder at the beginning of a new life, and to recover a sense that the fundamental thing we can do as a society, which I think is also spelled out very well in the Hannah Arendt exhibit today and in the talks I heard on Hannah Arendt, that societies have an obligation together to come together for the passing on of tradition and past to the next generation. And so how do we take up this call personally, but not atomistically, not individually, because it's a call for all of us to celebrate the meaning of children and the joy of new birth and the miracle of new life. How do we do this?
So I think one of the challenges is that anyone who kind of is a parent or knows parents is that there's obviously a lot of suffering, a lot of sacrifice, many, nights with, crying babies, and then teenagers who might be having, various dramas of one sort or another. So I think oftentimes we can see how hard it is to be a parent. And certainly I think the pop culture and social media often elevate kind of the more stressful and demanding dimensions of parenthood today. And so I think it's important for us to be kind of embedded in communities that can kind of attach meaning to the sufferings and sacrifices that parents have to make for their kids and for the benefit of family life. And we certainly see in the work of the psychologist Paul Bloom that kind of suffering and sacrifice are particularly actually kind of good for us up to a point when we kind of can endow them with a certain kind of meaning. And then we see in the classical work of the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, who you and I both read at Princeton, the kind of collective rituals also are incredibly important, kind of giving our lives meaning, and especially the dimensions of our lives that are, again, are more challenging, more stressful, more sacrificial. So I think, obviously one of the takeaways here is that we can understand and appreciate that religious communities have an important role in helping the rising generation kind of navigate the challenges of family life, the sacrifices that come from being parents, and to kind of help people who may have had very little experience with kind of being in the presence of babies on a regular basis, like your Chinese colleague, kind of to come alongside them and to kind of give them access to dads, and especially mothers who have lots of experience and can help them understand both the practical dimensions of caring for an infant, but also kind of make sense of the challenges and sacrifices as well, too. And we do see in my own work, for instance, that Americans who are religious are markedly happier in their marriages, they're markedly less likely to get divorced, and so it's kind of the family context that they enjoy. Well, of course, it's not perfect, is both more satisfying and more secure when it comes to this incredibly important and powerful and life-giving endeavor of raising the next generation.
I think what Brad's described, this has to happen from communities outward, kind of like from bottom up, I think, rather than from top down. And this is a sort of a one zip code at a time approach to kind of reclaiming something that we've lost too much of. It's very difficult through reason to explain to somebody who sees the world through an autonomy, convenience, consumer lens, what they're missing from the love and voluntary sacrifice and duty and obligation that are just fused into the nature of the family bond, this most important unit, this most important social unit in our world. And rather than try to involve inductive reasoning in this, I think a kind of demonstration effect is the way that people can kind of be persuaded by this, where they see more of it, they want more of it, I think. And one of the big differences between secular communities and other communities, or let's say between low fertility communities and higher fertility communities, zip code by zip code, differences in optimism, differences in confidence, differences in patriotism. For some reason, these are all kind of bundled together, and they're, I don't know that they're determinants, but they're characteristically different. And sometimes when you see it, you decide you want a taste of a little bit more of that. You like the way that flavor feels.
Right. So along these lines of the social learning that needs to happen for people to see what a family life is like where children are considered a blessing and a joy, behind all the statistics of the overall global population decline, there are always exceptions, right? Those are trends. And so my question for both of you is, in these contexts that you've worked in, the US and globally, who's bucking the trend? Who are the people that are having 5 kids or 6 kids? And what is that experience like? I have one friend in Austria who said, to have more than 1 kid is a radical thing to do, much less to have 6, because actually the entire society is now structured around families only having 1 or 2 kids. And so who's bucking the trend? And you, Brad, because I know you have 8 children, what's it like to be somebody who's bucking the trend and has a giant van driving all over the place? And, do people come to your house and be like, are you just going crazy all the time? And is your house upside down? And then when they walk in, as I do, and it's actually joyful and fun, and the kids are sitting there doing their homework and smiling, you think, wow, this is actually pretty cool. No? Oh, they just act like that when I'm there, I guess.
I mean, I think there is a lot of chaos, and I know there are a lot of big families here too. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of noise, all that kind of stuff. And it is challenging and stressful, and a lot of financial, challenges as well. So I think all the kind of things you'd expect of having a large family to some extent are true. But I think what people don't appreciate is, all the ways in which both our kids are kind of like, their own little tribe, and they derive a lot of, a lot of fighting and bickering, but also a lot of happiness from kind of being with and for one another. I think that's really kind of amazing and fun to see. Then too, being, as an adult, kind of having a large family means that you're kind of, at least for a long period of time, always with kind of younger kids, even when I'm 54. So even when you have, someone my age, I still have an 11-year-old, and there's just something kind of that's empowering and inspiring and makes me feel relatively young, having younger kids. I mean, every summer I'm in the neighborhood pool. Now it's with different kids over the years, but there's something about kind of being, in the pool with the young kids that I find life-giving. So that's kind of a more qualitative response to your question. One final anecdote that'll kind of just give you a sense of, I think, the value of having a larger family is that I was driving my younger 4 kids to our local Catholic school one morning, and my wife was heading off to work, and we were kind of voicemail texting back and forth to one another, and at the end of one of these texts, my youngest son in the back seat pipes in and says, in the middle of this voice text, I love you, I love you, I love you, 3 times. And my wife, we've been having like this pedestrian kind of conversation by text, on the phone, and she knew right away that this was from her son, not her husband. And of course, I'm embarrassed to report that the day after Valentine's Day, and I tried to do, okay last night, but my youngest son is particularly devoted to his mother, and so it's this kind of like, thing that happens where you're waking up, as a 50-something woman, and like the thing you see on this text chain at the end is, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I think that's the kind of the point.
That's such a beautiful story because, again, reflecting back on one of the panels earlier today, around this whole theme at the encounter, again, referring to Carter Snead, talking about how important it is to learn uncalculated giving and receiving. And one of the reasons that I, as a single woman, now as a married woman, like being around children is that they instinctively are uncalculated givers and receivers. Children teach us so much about what it is to connect. Children look you in the eyes. They see through whatever your stress is, and they see right into the heart. At least that's what I've always felt. And then when there's that explosion of some kind of beauty, by the way, they might say, I love you, I love you, I love you, right after having, thrown Cheerios with milk all over the back seat of the car or something like that, Yeah. But that explosion of self-giving love and attachment and need and just openness to express this fundamental human need for love and unconditional love. Not, Mommy, I love you because now you're going to forgive me for what I did with the Cheerios. But that pure expression of, I love you because you're my mother. Or I love you because you are here with me right now. And when I also think about some of the consequences of the decline in fertility, I think about our most vulnerable members of society, who obviously include children, but also include the disabled and the aging, who in the past would have been embraced by these larger communities of family. And if it's life-giving for you to be in the pool with an 11-year-old, how life-giving is it for an elderly grandmother to have her grandchild hugging her and saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. And how many people are entering older age with no grandchildren and with no children? And so what can we do to realize that children have this incredible capacity to give love that is so fundamental to everybody, regardless of what age we are or how many kids we ourselves have, that simply to be in the presence of kids whose nature it is to engage in self-giving love is an incredible, incredible gift. And how do we get this encounter with children if it's not in our own family? Any thoughts on that, Nick or Brad? Go ahead.
Margarita, thinking about what you and Brad just said so beautifully, it's a really strange time that we're living in, because there've never been as many people on Earth as there are today. We see the prospect of peaking and decline for the world ahead, but there's never been as many people as there are today. And there's so much loneliness. There's so much loneliness out there, despite there being so many people. Now, why do we think that's the case? Why do we think that's the case, right? When any of us try to explain to someone who's outside of this family world what it's like to build a family, it's like trying to describe Technicolor to someone who sees in black and white. You can tell them, but you have to experience it. And there is one country level exception, I think, that I ought to mention before we conclude to these trends, and that's Israel. Israel is a fantastically interesting counterexample in modernity against fertility decline. Actually, in Israel, over the last generation, fertility levels for Israeli Jewry have risen. And it's not all the ultra-Orthodox. It's also rising for people who regard themselves as secular Jews. Why is this? It's a really interesting question. One of my own guesses is that people in Israel want their country to have a future, and they want their families to be part of that future. And that's a pretty beautiful thing.
Well, let me ask the two of you if you would comment in the final minutes of our panel. The question of this panel is, why have children? How would you just answer that question, summarizing a bit perhaps what has been said, but fundamentally that's the question. Why have children?
So I think we've all heard that Aristotle kind of had this idea that we're social animals. And I think we're getting this message that I mentioned before, that I call kind of like the Midas mindset, that the true measure of a man or woman is the degree on their wall, or the money in their bank account, or the kind of career that they have. And I think what we see from Aristotle, and obviously from Thomas Aquinas and from many contemporary social scientific thinkers, is that more important than the kind of Midas mindset things like money and education and work, it's our social relationships that are so important to us, our friendships and our family relationships. And so in terms of having kids, I think there is often nothing more kind of powerful when it comes to giving our life a sense of meaning, direction, and purpose than having kids, having the opportunity to kind of guide them, through the beginning stages of life, and then having so many opportunities both to receive kind of expressions of love from them, but also to extend expressions of love to them as well. And then the final piece too, as I mentioned with this psychologist Paul Bloom, is that even kind of the sufferings and sacrifices that are bound up with fatherhood and bound up with motherhood end up, I think, oftentimes being redeemed by kind of all of the meaning and the love that we are able to kind of attach to and experience a connection with being both mothers and fathers. So that would be kind of my response to your question.
There's a reason that a lot of people think that solitary confinement in prison is a cruel and unusual punishment. The reason is because it takes away your connection with the rest of humanity. And it reduces your own humanity in the process. Part of what happens, I think, in family life is that it helps, it changes you, it helps complete you, and it may make you different and perhaps even better through the love and giving that you offer to other people. And I realize that's not a very consumerist way of looking at things, but family life brings, I think, a meaning that you can't find in other aspects of kind of consumer world. It's not the only place where one gets meaning. It's through faith, through work, through community. There are other ways of attachment as well, but there's a reason it's been the most fundamental unit of society since our species began. There's a certain social wisdom that's continued for thousands of generations.
Thank you, Nick. I mentioned to my students recently that I was going to be on this panel. I have children, and I have a student who is from Nigeria. She's pregnant with her second child, and she's been in a lot of my classes this year, and it's quite difficult. She has a sick child at home, and she's carrying a child, and she's been tired a lot. And so I said I was going to be on this panel, why have children? And she said, why have children? Because there is a great mystery, and it's inside of you, and it's growing. And there's nothing more incredible than that. And that reminded me of one of my favorite lines from Marilyn Robinson's novel, I think it was in Home, when she said, to look into the eyes of a newborn child is the closest we can ever get to seeing the face of God. And that line struck me because that mystery of a child that's growing, that is a life. When you look at the eyes of a newborn, there's just this sense of overwhelming possibility. And it's not then a calculation of how much sleep am I going to lose and what's going to happen and how much money there's going to be. You're just overcome with mystery and possibility. Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Brad. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
I just wanted to let you know that Brad is available at the Human Adventure book table for a book signing of Get Married, his instruction manual on how to defy the trend. And I also want to make sure you know there's another book signing opportunity for Dearest Friend, a work published in English about the servant of God, dear to many people here, Enzo Piccinini. The co-author of the book, Pier Paolo Bellini, is here and will be at the Human Adventure table at 3 o'clock, right outside in the auditorium. Please remember, your gift to the New York Encounter makes it free for all. Please don't forget to stop by the donation table and make a donation or go to newyorkencounter.org donate. It's a tax-deductible donation. Thank you.